ready to go. And a very good morning to each and every one of you again, and glad that you are with us. We appreciate you choosing to be with us. And thanks again. And we are studying the book of Matthew. Our study is coming from Matthew's chapters 5, 6, and 7, Sermon on the Mount, and we are learning, seeking to learn some things with respect to the meaning, the spiritual meaning, as well as the application of what this sermon means to us. And we're going to evaluate, we're going to look at, again, the spiritual meaning of what the Master is saying in terms of, there are two statements here. One, he said that you have heard it was said, but I say unto you. Again, you've heard it was said. He brings Moses into the fray. We receive the law at the hands of Moses, and we receive, and therefore it could not give life. It brought condemnation. Because when we break one, we're guilty of breaking all. And now he tells us, but I say unto you. The question is, who's the I? Who is it that is speaking to us that I say unto you? And that's the part that we need to understand. Let me preface it by saying that, as I often say, that I'm very thankful I had some good teachers. I believe they meant well, but some of them were, when it came to deeper spiritual things, I don't think the knowledge was there. And I want to be kind in saying this, that, we were taught, we were educated, we are not under the law. And, if we are not under the law, here is a question I have. What is the spiritual application of the law, or what is my responsibility to the spiritual application of the law? Again, what is my responsibility to the spiritual application of the law? That is what the Master is pointing out here. He says, you've heard it was said, but I say unto you. And he points out in Matthew chapter 5, he says that whosoever therefore shall break one of these last commandments and shall teach men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Notice there the two verbs, do and teach. We have a responsibility. Those of us who teach the Word of God, we have a responsibility to learn the things of God and to seek God's wisdom, to understand the things, and then to ask God for wisdom, to be able to put it together and to communicate it clearly to people so that people will get that the clear thoughts of God is not us as human beings simply reading something into the text. We have to be able to take the time and put in the effort, because those of us who teach the Word of God, we have to understand that this is an office that has been given to us by the living Christ. When he ascended up on high, Ephesians chapter 4, he appointed gifted men to the church for the developing of people. And therefore we have the responsibility to learn, not only to learn, but also to do and to teach. The doing comes first. The doing comes first, and then the teaching. And then, again, we need to understand, we have, when Jesus said that, but I say unto you, well, what he is alluding to and what he is driving at, simply, we function from a new presence and a new center. Again, in the Christian faith, we function from a new presence and a new center, as opposed to what we say today, the 21st century. What we say today in the 21st century is that we function from a church name, a church baptism, a church Lord's Supper, a church a cappella. And really and truly, my question is, now all these things are right. All of these things are biblically true. But here is my question. My question, brother, sister, if you're functioning from these things, then what is it producing in your life? Where is the spiritual application, as well as what's the fruit, what are the deeds, what's the behavior? That is what Jesus was after. And the Jews prided themselves in, we function from the law. We are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We are God's chosen people. Jesus said, yes, that's true. All that is true. That indeed is true. But the question is, what is it producing? What is the truth in that, in terms of the presence of God, in terms of the spiritual application of what you claim to follow? And so then, in the Christian faith, if you and I continue to say today that the people we surround ourselves with, or the people around us, continue to say that we function, church name, church system, church doctrine, then my question is this, where is the presence of Christ? What is the new presence we function from? So when, again, we go back to Acts chapter 1, when Jesus was risen from the dead, and just before he ascended up to be with the living God in heaven, as the sovereign, eternal Lord of heaven and earth, with all authority and all power in his hands given unto him, God took the universal scepter of authority and power and placed it into the hands of this king. He's the universal king. And we bow to this king. And when we understand that he said that he made himself the object of the Christian faith and witness. You're going to be my witnesses. You're going to tell people about me and point them to me. Now, in the 21st century, now that was the first century, but also the second, third, fourth centuries, indeed, people simply, the early church and the apostles, the early church fathers were pointing people to the living Christ, and they were bringing people to the living Christ. And the impact, as well as the implication, as well as the power of the gospel, is felt among the Jewish people as well as in the Greco-Roman world. And many people simply were coming to Christ. And when, after the death, historically the death of Aurelius Augustine died, the 4th century, and the church went into what is known as a Dark Ages for 1,000 years, from the 4th century to the 14th century. And then came the Reformation. In the 1,000 years, simply, of the Dark Ages, men and women, God used priests, God used nuns, God used the seminaries, and God used these people to write and preserve his truth. And then came the Reformation. And after the Reformation came the Enlightenment in the 17th century. And historically, that the church, when the church moved away from pointing people to Christ, they were simply pointing people to themselves, the church system, the church doctrine. So here is the great divide. In the 1st century, we were commanded to point people to Christ. And in the 21st century, there is a tremendous shift away from our worldview. In our Christian worldview, we are pointing people to the church name, the church system, to church doctrine, the church baptism, the church Lord's Supper. And the question is, what is it producing? So there is a tremendous shift. It's not producing the character of Christ. And when it's not producing the character of Christ, we have to go back and we have to reevaluate. Are we simply, here is the question, and we must be honest with this, are we simply then following a Christianity? Are we simply following a Christianity that has no Christ in it, or corrupt version or corrupt form of Christianity? In other words, we have a doctrine, we have a system, but the question is, where is the presence of the holiness of God? Where is the presence of the eternal Christ? Where is the presence of the power of the Holy Spirit to regenerate where we have by the things of God? Folks, we're not born again by water, by Lord's Supper, and by baptism. We're not born again, folks, by those things. We are not born again by what we do. We need to understand very clearly, go back and study John chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. Jesus said, we are not born, that we are born, that the class statement there is that we are born of the Spirit. In other words, that he and this is how he presents it. He says that but you see the wind. Actually, you see the trees and the leaves and the branches rustling, and you hear the sound of the wind, but you do not see where the wind is coming from, and you do not know where it's going. And here is the statement. So it is he who is born of the Spirit, which means it's from above, not from anything we do. And we have missed that in the church. We've completely missed that. So we hold on to a system where we function from ourselves and what we do rather than from the new presence we have. And the new presence we have, as well as a new center, again, in Christianity, in our Christian faith and worldview, we have a new presence and we have a new center. That new presence is the risen and living Christ, and that new center is the risen and living Christ. Now, if I were to deny that, or if I were to resist that, and I will ask the question, what's the alternative? If I were to say then that Christ is not the center, and that Christ is not the new presence, what's the alternative? The alternative is me. The alternative is me as a human being, what I do, and that's exactly what Jesus condemned in the Jews in John chapter 8, where they held themselves in their religious practices and their religious beliefs, and they were doing the things of the law, but it produced no life. We are doing the things we say today of Christianity, but what is the life? Why is it that the church is so spiritual? This is an observation, not a judgment. Why is it that the church today, general observation, that the church is so spiritually dead? My question is, when there is such corruption in human society, wherever we are, wherever we live, when there is such corruption in human society, the question is, where is the salt and where is the light? Where is God's people? Are we hiding our light on the bushel? And if we are, then we are good for nothing. I mean, the phrase good for nothing it means that we have lost our saltedness. And when we have lost our saltedness, then we are good for nothing and we are trodden under the feet of men. So my question again is, what sense are we functioning from? Are we functioning from the center where Christ is the presence? Are we functioning from a new center? Are we functioning from the center of ourselves, the church name, church system, church doctrine, and so on and so forth? And this is what we're going to simply aim at. And when we function from Christ as the center, as the new center, we have an absolute by which to live. By the way, when you and I break bread every first day of the week, that is a point of reference for you and I, where we re-examine ourselves, when we re-evaluate ourselves, but also to the re-examination and the re-evaluation with a sense of holiness, with a sense of understanding we are sinful people, and that by the grace of God, God's grace enables us to come into his presence. We are imputed with Christ's righteousness, and therefore God fellowships us based on that. And we come to understand that the reality is that here is Christ, and here is his presence, and that in understanding that, we come to the truth that had it not been for the grace of God in my life, what my life would have been like. If you don't understand that statement, let's take a look at members of your family and your friends who are not members of the body of Christ, or who are not privileged as you and I are privileged in relationship with God, spiritual relationship. Look at their lives. Look at how they live their lives. Look at how they make the decisions. Look at how they speak. Listen to their language. And notice there that there is no God in it. And our job is to pray for them. Part of our work is to pray for them, that God will touch them, regenerate their hearts, regenerate their minds, grant them repentance to obey the gospel. Yes, because we love them and we want them to be saved. We want and we desire that the Almighty work in their lives as the Almighty is working in our lives and regenerating us, and that as we sense the hand of Christ in our lives, they also too can do that, sense the hand of Christ in their lives. So that in the Christian faith, we simply, and folks, in Christianity, we need to understand, those of us not our responsibility to build a church. That's God's responsibility. Let me run that by you again. It is not our responsibility to build a church. That's God's responsibility. It's our responsibility to develop people spiritually. It's our responsibility to develop people, and in so doing, God builds His church. Too many times we focus on numbers. Too many times we focus on folks who are not there rather than folks who are there. Folks, we need to change our thinking and understand that you and I cannot build the church. It is Jesus who builds the church through our obedience, as well as through us developing people, through us pointing people to Christ. It is Christ who builds this church. He builds His church by building Himself in the lives of people. It's the presence of Christ that makes the difference. So this whole idea that, with the emphasis in modern Christianity is larger buildings, bigger buildings, and more people, and really and truly, folks can go for that. Quite frankly, my interest is not in that. My interest is developing people. My interest is developing people, not only developing people, but also teaching people, pointing them to Christ the Savior. In so doing, He will do His work in their lives in building His church. Again, it is Christ who builds His church. So then, how do we build and develop people? How do we build and develop people? Again, we build and we develop people simply with the recognition that in God, it's the living God who's the subject of the verb. In Matthew 18:28, he said that, Paul says that we know that God works all things together for the good. Notice there that God lives. And He lives and He works in your life and my life. In so doing, God reconciles us to Himself. God regenerates us in the new birth. God transforms us. God conforms us to the image of His Son. And God replaces the old man with the new nature. Christianity is not an improvement. God simply gives to us the mind of Christ, and we are now able to reflect in our lives the character of Christ. We can now love God. We can now know the thoughts of God. We can know the will of God. We can love our neighbor. We can love ourselves. We can love our enemy. Christianity goes against the grain of our thinking because it's normal. It's normal for us to despise people. It's normal for us to harbor grudges. It's normal for us not to forgive. But when we love and we forgive, that is abnormal, meaning it goes against our thinking because of the presence of Christ in our lives. So Jesus now comes in, and this we're going to look at, the spiritual application of the law. Now, when Jesus said, in verses 21 following, He said several times in the text, He says, "You have heard it was said, but I say unto you." You have heard it was said, but I say unto you. Again, who is the I that is speaking to us? The I that is speaking to us is God incarnate, the Emmanuel, God with us. Again, the I that is speaking to us is the one who says, I am that I am. That is why the Jews sought to stone Him, because they understood that statement in John chapter 8, verse number 58, where Jesus claimed to be equal with God, and therefore that was offensive, that was blasphemous to them, and therefore they sought to stone Him, because they know that simply that was a true statement. And so then who is the I that is speaking to us? Again, the I that is speaking to us is the risen Christ. Again, in Christianity, Jesus simply started by saying, we function from a new center. We live and think out of a new center. That new center is Christ. Again, what the law could not do, Paul tells us in Romans 8:3 and 4, what the law could not do is that God sending His own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh. Who is this Son? Who is this Christ? He is the Emmanuel, God with us. He's the incarnate God, as well as He's the one who has all authority, the sovereign Lord of heaven and earth. So we have a new presence from which to function from. Folks, again, let me just say this, and please accept this in the way it's intended. Anytime we claim to function from baptisms and church names and church Lord's Suppers and a cappella singing, really and truly, that's the truth. But that's a truth that has, it's just a biblical truth that has no life in it. And the question is, where is the Christ? So then, Christ gives to us, and God gives to us, and Christ came to fulfill all righteousness. Christ fulfilled the righteousness of the law by keeping the law perfectly again, for what the law could not do in that it was weak through the flesh. God sending his Son in the likeness of sinful flesh. Now notice there, in the spiritual application of the law, what is Jesus doing here? He said, you have heard it was said, but I say unto you. And Jesus went back and he pulls in the sixth commandment. Now, I believe that I have drawn to the conclusion after many years of studying the Word of God that when God gave the Ten Commandments, it was given in two tablets. Of course, one tablet has a relationship with God and man and God, and the second tablet has a relationship with man and man. And Jesus started his meaning of the law by simply pulling the sixth commandment. And he said, you've heard it was said that I say unto you. And he goes on to say that whosoever shall be angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment, or whosoever calls his brother Raka, shall be in danger of the judgment, or whosoever calls his brother fool. Now, why did Jesus start with that? Why did Jesus? And for many years, I studied this, and I studied it very carefully. And my approach to this was two angles. One, I looked at this from the human point of view. Okay, I'm looking at this as an unsafe person, and I'm looking at this as a saved person. And when an unsaved person looks at this, I looked at this also from the Jewish angle. And why is Jesus saying this? And notice here he said that you have heard it was said that I say unto you. Now, really and truly, the Jews lived by what the rabbi said, because they went through for 1,400 years. They were saying the rabbi said this, the teacher said this, the master said this, and Jesus comes in and he said, you heard it was said. He took their statement, but I am saying now, I say unto you. And he follows up with a deeper righteousness. He said, accept your righteousness. Prior to that, he says, accept your righteousness, then exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, the people understand, historically, the people were living their lives by saying, the rabbi said this, the teacher said this, or we heard this in the synagogue, very much like Christians saying, well, the preacher said this, or the teacher said this, or the church said this, or the church believes this. And people go through life living like that, and therefore there was in the Jewish thinking there was the absence of the presence of God, and in Christian thinking there is the absence of the presence of Christ. So what we have a religious practice without God in the Jewish people, and with the Jewish people, and with the church people. And Jesus comes in and said, you've heard it was said, but I say unto you. And what he's dealing with the sin of anger. He's dealing with the sin of anger. And really and truly, he's dealing with our deeds. He's dealing with our deeds and our relationship and the fruit and the behavior, how we treat our brethren. And basically what he's saying here is this. It's the whole idea of us in our thinking, number one, how we see ourselves, and we see ourselves and the conversation we have in our head and the pictures we paint in our head is a very judgmental picture of ourselves. We don't like what we see. Secondly, when we don't like what we see is we project that on others through our relationship, through our speech, and through our behavior. It's like this. Picture for a minute. We use, suppose then we create a picture of a hammer. Imagine a hammer. A hammer is a blunt force. And a hammer is used simply for one purpose, to hammer the hammer nails into a piece of timber. And really, truly, it's a blunt force. And I want to say this with respect to how we think, but also how we use the tongue. And Jesus says, you heard it was said, but I say unto you. And then he goes on to say, if you call your brother rack or fool, what he's talking about is judgment. What he's talking about is judgment, and we murder people with our tongue. And really and truly, what's the motivation of the heart? Again, he strikes. Jesus is striking at the human heart. He said, you have heard it was said, thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not murder. But I say unto you, now here is the spiritual application and the spiritual implication of the law. He says, and he deals with what is the intention. The reason why a human being, let's take, for example, here, Genesis 4, Cain murdered Abel. What was the intention? His intent, his anger led him to murder his brother. And Jesus is dealing with the motive. The motive of the heart is to belittle, to destroy, to hate, and we use the tongue to destroy people. And Jesus tells us here, now notice here, notice in the teachings of Christ what he did. You know, today we place emphasis on worship, how important it is to go to church, how important it is to go to church, go to church, go to church, go to church. Jesus' thinking is different. Now notice what he said. He said that if you have a problem with your brother, if you have a problem with your sister, he's dealing with the motivation of the heart, he's dealing with the intent of the heart, he's dealing with the wrong thinking. He says, you go and you make that right. He said, you reconcile with your brother before you go to worship. Now notice there that Jesus places reconciliation with our brothers and sisters before worship. Now, I'll go back and look at the text. He says that you go and you make it right before you go and offer your gift to God in the synagogue. And what he's talking about is this, folks. Stay with me. Don't let me lose you. He says, but I say unto you, who is the I? What he's talking about is, and here is the beauty of and the power and the reference point of the presence of Christ in our lives. He's saying that I say unto you, he says, there you have now a new center with which to think, and you have a new righteousness. Now notice there, the key is that we can harbor a grudge against our brother or against our sister, and we can go to church and sing the hymn, oh, how I love Jesus, and Jesus says, no, 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 no. You never made it right. You don't make it right. You read your Bible, and you use the tongue to destroy people, and you come and you worship me, you bow to me, you sing the hymns and so on and so forth. Jesus said, no, 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 you did not make it right. You are not functioning from me as your righteousness, your new righteousness and your new center. You're functioning from yourself, and therefore, Matthew chapter 7, later on, when people said to him, church people said to him, Lord, we did this in your name. What does Jesus say? I never knew you. They never function. The spiritual application of the law is dealing with the spiritual application of the law. So the whole idea that we say that we're not living under the law, so then what about the spiritual application of the law? When I have a problem, of malice, when I have a problem of envy, when I have a problem, I know I've heard my brother or my sister said something against me. What should I do? Should I harbor a grudge? Should I put up a wall? Or should I go and say, brother, I understand that, there is a problem? Or should we make excuses, saying, or dismiss it? No. Jesus says no. We have a responsibility. Now notice there again, in the teachings of Christ, your responsibility, my responsibility is to go to the brother, is to go to the sister. And once we go to them and we point out the problem and we make reconciliation, we are not responsible for the outcome. In other words, we are not responsible for their behavior. We are only responsible for our behavior. me run that by you. Too many times we have in our minds, well, I know I heard this, I heard that, and we are thinking, well, if I go to the brother, if I go to the sister, what will their attitude be? What will the response be? Folks, we cannot defend a negative. We cannot defend what people are thinking. And therefore, Jesus deals with this. We are responsible for a response. We are not responsible for the outcome. They have a responsibility. Our responsibility is that we are responsible for our sins, and Jesus said, really and truly, we are responsible for making it right. So then how do we use the tongue? We use the tongue in the spiritual application of the law. We use the tongue as a hammer, and Jesus is a blunt force, and Jesus is dealing with the motivation of the heart. All my years, I've heard people in church and outside the church where people simply, they murder people's character. They put people down. What is the motivation? The motivation simply is the hate. It's really and truly it's belittling people. And that's what Paul talks about in Ephesians chapter 4, the last 2-3 verses there. And when he talks about simply putting away, and actually, if you will just right quickly, let me turn to the text, and let's see. And it says, Ephesians chapter 4, verses number 31 and 32, he says, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor. That word clamor is the Greek word, and it means slander. And one of the names for Satan is slander. And what Jesus is saying to these Jewish people and to us in the church, when we go through life without him being the new center, and without him being his righteousness, and we go through life slandering people, and what he's dealing with is with the motive, and with the motive simply he says, look, he's going to judge us. And he tells us again that he deals with the Sixth Commandment. Why does he start his teaching with the Sixth Commandment? Again, he starts with it to help us to understand that again, there are two centers from which we function. We function from our center as a human being. We offer to God our works, and we think that God will accept us based upon what we do. And Jesus says, yes, to the Jews, this is what you're doing, but really and truly, there is no presence of God. And then he comes and he says, here is another center. The other center is him and his righteousness, and therefore he says, accept your righteousness. Now, folks, again, we go to the brother, we go to the sister, and we make it right. Again, why is Jesus doing that? He's talking about judging, he's talking about condemning, he's talking about putting people down, he's talking about using the tongue as a blunt force, as a carpenter uses a hammer. Over the years I've heard people say this, and this is again how we put people down. You may have experienced this. Sometimes we hear people say that, just in passing, well, and over the years, they did this, and we are responsible for your conversion, and we are responsible for, who you are today, and so on and so forth. Well, that is a put down. What they're saying is, I am better than you. Not only am I better than you, but without me, you could not be where you are today. That is a self-centered righteousness. Folks, whenever people think like that, there is no God in that. In other words, they're taking the place of God. The outcome, what you do today and how you live your life is because of the power and the grace of God in your life. A human being may contribute something to, your development and your thinking, but really and truly it is God. It is Paul who says, we are what we are by the grace of God. Paul simply had great teachers in his education. And sometimes too, Christian people do stupid things like that, and they, I don't know if they're conscious of what they're doing, really and truly, but we go through life and we belittle people, and we go through chapter 18, 6, 7, and 8, he says that if we induce others to sin, we are responsible for that sin also. We'll be judged for that sin. But we are responsible for our sins, and he starts with judgment. He starts with the motivation of the heart. And why do we run people down? Why do people do things like that? The reason why is because in their thinking, in their conversation in the mind, that's how they think, that's how they see themselves. And then it comes out in the speech, then it comes out in the behavior. I'll say this as someone who's cross-culture and been lived in this country for nearly 33, 34 years in ministry, dealing with and laboring with, folks have always pointed out, things like, you're foreigner, minority, you speak with an accent. Really and truly, I have to dismiss that because really and truly, I don't focus on things like that. I'm sorry that people think that way. That's them. I focus and I concentrate on what I'm called to do. And what I do, it has content, it has substance, and you focus and be faithful in little things that you're called to do each day. Because, again, and sometimes you hear very negative, demeaning things as, in working with people. And, really negative and ugly things. And again, you dismiss it. Sometimes you have to, I've learned over the years not to respond to everything in life. You have to be prudent, because the reason why I'm saying that is because there are some people who, no matter what you say, you cannot have a conversation with them. You just can't have a conversation. So what do? In a very silent way, you just leave it alone, and you trust God to work things out, and you go about doing what you're called to do. And so that Jesus starts with, he starts with simply the intentions and the motives of the heart, the improper use of the tongue. The improper use of the tongue as a blunt force to destroy the mean people. And, it's amazing that, it's sad. It's really sad that we don't, in the church, don't understand that we have a new center. We just simply don't understand that we have a new righteousness. We simply don't understand we have a new presence. And that's, and again, what is involved in that is simply conversion. It is Christ who converts us, the presence of Christ. And it takes a long time. Conversion takes a while. And again, when Jesus started with, and from the 6th commandment, he moved to the 7th commandment. Notice here what he says. Again, he deals with the intentions and the motives of the heart. Exodus 20 and 14. He says, you heard it was said, but I say unto you. It says, thou shalt not commit adultery, but I say unto you, whosoever looketh upon a woman to lust. He deals with intentions and the motives of the heart. And what he's talking about here, folks, is wandering mind and wandering eyes. And the reason why he's dealing with wandering minds and wandering eyes is because, again, with the presence of Christ, we're able to see, older women as our mothers and younger women as our sisters, and we accept them, and therefore there will be no lust toward them. Again, that's what he's talking about. That's the solution to the human problem of lust. And then later on, he would say, actually, he already said, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. So again, this whole idea, and we don't have the time to go into any divorce, remarriage, and the stands on that, and so on and so forth. I'm simply dealing with, the spiritual application of the law. Again, in this, you've heard it was said, and I say unto you, with the new mind and with the new motive, simply with the mind of Christ, we're able to see people differently. We're able to see people differently, and we function from Christ's center. We function from that center. Christ is the new center. Christ is the new righteousness. And Christ's mind, and with the mind of Christ, it enables us so that we will not simply live with lust. Men lust after women, and women lust after men. If you don't believe women lust after men, then, I need for you to explain to me Genesis chapter 37, where Potiphar's wife, simply was telling Joseph, come lie with me, if that is not less than what that is, what is that? And again, Christ is teaching, there is here is that we are able to fulfill the righteousness of the law, and Christ kept the law perfectly, and when he kept the law perfectly, we are able to fulfill, with the presence of Christ, we are able to fulfill the righteousness of the law, for what the law could not do, in that God sent his Son. Christ kept the law perfectly, and with the presence of Christ, with the regenerating presence of Christ, we are able now to see and to accept people differently. We're able now to see and to accept people differently, place value in people. I wouldn't go there. I was going to say something personal, but I wouldn't go there. I just leave it alone. And again, he moves from there, and he moves now to about bearing false witness. He moves now to the 9th commandment. He says that, in Matthew 5:33 and 37, he talks about oath and he talks about truth. He says here, you have heard it was said, thou shalt not bear false witness, but I say unto you, let your yea be yea and your nay be nay. What he's talking about is simply that when we give our word, and our word is our bond, and we don't simply make excuse. I point out to people sometimes, a truth about how people live their lives. And several times, for example, over the years, we set up a time. The class is going to start promptly at 7 o'clock or promptly at 8 o'clock, and people would come in 5 minutes after, 10 minutes after, 15 minutes after. Now, prior to coming in at the time, we already agreed that, that the time is going to be, we're going to start at 7 o'clock. And people would come in and say, well, I was late because of the traffic. And I point this truth out to them, you are living a lie. In other words, you're making excuse, and that's how you live your life. You're making an excuse to go through life by making the traffic an excuse. You already give your word at 7 o'clock. That's just one example. That's just one example how people live their lives, and they're not even aware of that. That's the cultural norm of things. As a matter of fact, in 2 different cultures that, we were in the Philippines and as well as in India, and the night before they dropped us off at the hotel, and we finalized that you guys are going to pick us up at 8:30. And what time are we starting? We're starting at 9 o'clock. And we got dressed and had breakfast and everything, and we got downstairs at 8:30, and 8:30 came around, 9:05 came around, 9:15 came around, and about 9:20 they came picking up. I was serious. And they said to me, that's how things are done in the culture. I said, well, I need to be very open with you. That is basically how you do things in a culture. That's the cultural norm. But this is what Jesus said. When you give your word, in other words, you're living the Christian life and you're controlled by the culture, not by Christ. And people, sometimes it needs to be pointed out. That's how people live their lives, by cultural norms rather than by the truth of Christ. When we give our word, when we follow through, and it tells us that, and again, Jesus tells us, and here is the clincher, that we function from a new center, we function from a new person, and that new center, that new person is Christ. And folks, you've just got to do what is right. You've just got to do what is right, because no matter what you say, no matter what you do, some people would never get it. But that's not your responsibility. It is God's responsibility to change the hearts and minds of people. That's God's power, and God will do that. And then Jesus goes on to in Matthew 5:38 through 42. He talks about simply for tooth. What he did was he pulls in Leviticus 24, he pulls in Deuteronomy 19, and he pulls in Exodus 21. He pulls in these three verses. And then he says, of course, it teaches about an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And then he says here, he says that, but I say unto you, resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite you on the right cheek, turn to the other. And I went back to him and said, wait a minute, what is going on here? And I had to really study this carefully, and I came to the text, looking at the text from a cultural point of view, and I forgot who was speaking. And then I started to study, and I looked at, and I stayed with the text, and then what was the clincher for me is verse number 43. He says this. It opened my eye. It opened my eyes to something I've never seen before. And he says this: "You have heard it has been said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thy enemies." Wait a minute. And I said, wait a minute. Where is it said in the Old Testament? And I examined the Old Testament for this phrase, "hate thy enemy." And it is never said nowhere in the Old Testament. God never said that. And then I started wait a minute, who is speaking here and to whom? And I went back and I reconstructed the cultural norm of what was been said. So when Jesus said, love your enemy, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, he is saying that phrase, hate your enemy, was in the Talmud. That is what the Jews interpreted the commandment to mean, that when you love God, when you love your neighbor, you hate your enemy. And Jesus said, that's what you believe. That's what the rabbis were teaching. God never said that. So the phrase, hate your enemy is not in the Bible. It is not in the Old Testament. It was pulled over from the rabbinical teaching of the Talmud, that what the rabbis were saying, and Jesus said, here is what you are believing, here is what you are teaching, and here is your belief system. Therefore, you hate people. You claim to be God's people. You love your neighbor, but you hate your enemy. And Jesus says, no. He says, here, but I say unto you. Now, and I when I recreated the context, I understood what was said. And I asked myself again, now notice there what Jesus says. But I say unto you. And notice there the verbs. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you. Pray for them that despitefully use you and persecute you. That you may be the children of God. Now notice there, Jesus, God's children are defined by certain qualities. Now we say today, because someone is baptized, to go to church, to read the Bible, to break bread, to support missions, to engage in church ministry, they're a child of God. No, folks, that is our definition. God did not give me the right to say who his children are. God reserves the right for himself to define his children, again, by certain definable qualities. It is God who says who his children are, not you, not me. And notice the definable qualities. That you love your enemies, you bless them, you do good to them, and you pray for them that persecute you. It is God, and it has nothing to do with being baptized, church, Lord's Supper, singing without a piano, and so on and so forth. Now, I believe it constitutes that, but really and truly, there are people who simply, they don't break bread every first day of the week. I've been around them. They don't simply, really and truly sing a cappella. I've been around some of them, really, and I've seen the love of Christ and the grace of God and the presence of Christ in these people more than I've seen in the people who claim to simply say they're the true ones. Now, that's not a judgment. Again, that's just an observation. That's just an observation. And Jesus is talking about, he said, how do we handle evil? Again, how do we handle evil? We are living in an evil world, and people people are downright evil. How do we handle evil? And this is what he says. He says you do good to them. He says you pray for them. He says you give them a cup of cold water in my name. He says you do good to them. I went back, and I want to pass this on to you from the year 2000 to just about 2 years ago. I studied the life of Mother Teresa, Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, and Dr. King. And I wanted to know, really and truly, first of all, Gandhi, and how did he arrive at this worldview? And I came to realize Gandhi in his autobiography said that he could not pin his worldview on Hinduism or in Islam because there is nothing in Hinduism or in Islam that has the worth of the human being. And he had to turn to the teachings of Christ, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, to pin his worldview as well as to get value for human beings. And this is one of the scriptures that he simply focused on, and simply in order to get independence from Britain for the Indian people, he had to emphasize on simply telling the people of India, he says, do not simply resist the British, but do good to them. The same idea simply was followed by Mother Teresa, as well as Dr. King, as well as Nelson Mandela, where they were able to accomplish in their worldview, because of the teachings of Christ, what they did was when the people that were fighting against, they simply did not resist the evil, they did good to them. Because in Hinduism, there is nothing like that. In Islam, there is nothing like that. Only in the Christian faith and worldview. Today, when the birth of Dr. King is celebrated, there is nothing about his worldview. How did he arrive at his worldview? And what gave him his worldview? Nothing like that at all. Now, that's just an observation I'm making, and we can talk about that another time. So Jesus said, he stated it negatively, thou shalt not. And the commandment stated it negatively. What Jesus is talking about, folks, is a new presence, is a new center, and he's the new presence, he's the new center, and he is the new righteousness that we have, and we are able now to love our enemies. Here is what he said. He says to love God with all your heart. The first commandment is love God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul. And notice there that how that first commandment, Matthew 22, 37 to 40, how it is presented in a very real way in the second commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. We cannot love our neighbors ourselves if we don't love God first. And here is where Jesus teaches us to develop a high and a holy view of God. But in so doing, we will develop a high view of ourselves. So many times I hear people talk about low self-esteem, they're depressed, and so on and so forth. And the solution poses this. It's not that people are not ill. It's not that people should not be given medication and so on and so forth. That's true. I agree, accept all of that. But one of the problems is, among Christian people is that they have a very low view of God, or a non-existent view of God. And when there is a low view of God, a non-existent view of God, they have a low self-esteem. And when they have low self-esteem, what happens is it results in the depression. And then they have to go to psychiatrists and the psychologists to get medication to be met up, and simply it produces more and more depression. I'm not saying, folks, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that people are not ill. I'm not saying that they should not receive medication. I'm not saying that. Don't get me wrong. I'm saying this. One of the key things is to develop a healthy and a high view of God. You see, folks, it is normal. It is normal. Jesus says that the Son of, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten know what it is? Again, do we know what it says? We know what John 3:16 says. But do we know what John 3:17 says? It says this: "For God sent His Son not into the world to condemn the world, but the world through Him might have life." In other words, might be saved. We what He's talking about, we have no problems of butchering up ourselves and belittling ourselves. We are good at that. We butcher ourselves, and therefore we do it in our minds and we do it in our speech to others. You see, it is normal. It is very normal for us to blame God and to hate God and to blame ourselves, hate ourselves, and hate other people. But what is abnormal is to love God and to love ourselves and love other people. That's abnormal. And the new presence and the new center, the presence of Christ is a new presence and a new center, allows us to love ourselves and to love God. To love God and love ourselves and love others. You see, the cross. God takes the cross and plants the cross in your life and in my life, and we're able to function from that cross and from that presence. Jesus leads us to fulfill the righteousness of the law. Jesus leads us to fulfill the righteousness of the law. Therein is the fulfillment of His statement, "Except your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees," meaning there that He leads us to fulfill the righteousness of the law. You and I cannot do that, folks, by ourselves. Certainly me as a human being, I am a sinful human being. I'm as wicked can be. But God's presence makes a difference. There is an internal change. In our thinking, there is an observable change. There is simply the spiritual life in following Christ. And again, in the involvement of following Christ, there is also Jesus is dealing with the fruit, He's dealing with the behavior, He's dealing with our deeds. Our deeds, simply, He tells us pray for people, He tells us to do good to them, and we don't always pray for people, we don't always do good to people, we don't always bless people. As human beings, we don't always do things like that, but also with the enabling presence of Christ, we're able to do these things now. So Jesus simply gives to us a new presence and a new power, and this new presence and new power then leads us to value the things of God, leads us to value ourselves, and leads us to value other people. Again, we are dealing with the spiritual implication, the spiritual application of the law, and the spiritual application, let me close with this, the spiritual application of the law, simply there is a new center. The new center is the presence of Christ and the power of Christ. If we miss that, folks, and when we miss that, we would just be churchgoers. And to be honest with you, I have no intention and no interest in just being a churchgoer. I have no intention. And I'm getting old in life, and I'm looking to make some, drastic changes in certain things in my life. Assess my own training, my own education, assess where I am, what I'm doing, what I would like to do for the rest of my life. If God gives me life 5 more years, if God gives me life 10 more years, if God gives me life 15 more years, what would I like to do with life? How would I like to use my knowledge? How would I like to use my education? And again, I am making decisions based on what is best for really and truly advancing the things of God. And I'll close with this, and it's a very powerful example. In the game of chess, when the players come out from the box, you have the kings, the queens, the bishops, the rooks, we play the game, and in life, in very many ways, the game of chess represents life. Some people who are able to, be a king, they're able to jump other people, and a queen jump other people, and bishops exert power and kings exert power, and we are considered to be the rooks, and so on and so forth. And here is the key. And at the end of that game, the king, the queen, the bishop, the rooks, everybody go back into the box. You get the point? At the end of life, the box. We all are going to go into a box, folks. There's one appointment we will never miss. That appointment has been set. The question is, what is our center? And who's the center? And it's not about simply, people go through life, and monopoly, and monopoly also represents very much like life. They buy this, they buy that, they own this, they own that. And at the end of life, folks, they're going to carry nothing. God made it very clear that we brought nothing into the world and we carry nothing out. And here is a phrase, that's the existence, the image of how people live their lives, the image of the existence. That's the image of the existence. Jesus gives to us a new image for existence. And the new image for existence is his center and his presence and his righteousness. Guys, thank you for being here this morning. We appreciate it very much. This lesson has been taped. And by the way, prior to getting these classes set up, when Winfred and